Welcome to Dr. Lottie's Science with Soul. I am Dr. Lottie and the host of this podcast. Today, I am really excited to introduce Jim Bruton. Jim Bruton has been fortunate to realize most of his childhood dreams. Watching wildlife television programs as a child, then living in Africa and winning an Emmy for his work with National Geographic Television. Dreaming of sci-fi gadgets while reading through Popular Mechanics, and then shrinking a television truck into a backpack, transmitting live video from all 7 continents of the world. His love of vintage aircraft translated from gluing models together as a boy to building and flying of 2 historical reproduction airplanes. Jim experienced an out-of-body near-death experience after his airplane crashed and is the author of The In-Between, A Trip of a Lifetime, and The Practice in Between, The Art of Letting Go. So welcome, Jim. It's such an honor to have you as a guest today.
Hi, Dr. Lottie. It's great to be here.
So tell me a little bit about, you have such an interesting background. So tell us a little bit about the different kind of work that you have done before you had your NDE, and then we'll talk about your NDE.
Sure. Well, you captured it pretty well in a nutshell. I think in addition to saying, I've been able to live a lot of my childhood dreams, I think those were childhood dreams because I was just so curious as a child, and anything that could capture my imagination was something, that fascinated me. So as with, many kids watching television, they love animals. They love the idea of travel around the world and visiting native and local people, spending time with them, and really just seeing, what we have in common and what we share. And then, of course, for a little boy growing up in the 60s, looking at Popular Mechanics of, when are we going to have a flying saucer in a garage, or when are we going to have a jetpack to fly to work? I mean, we were all at that time working to beat the Russians to the moon. So it's very natural that what we could call science fiction was in everyday news. So again, something that captured my imagination. And for me, that science fiction dream was expressed in, inventions and technology. And so that later on, when I was able to, like I say, shrink a TV truck into a backpack and transmit video from places never before possible, that was all part of that dream. To extend that a little further, I became a lecturer at Yale University School of Medicine, where I used my satellite system I invented to integrate with various kinds of biometrics destined for the International Space Station. And we went to Mount Everest 2 years in a row to test them out. And I just thought that was kind of a cool, full closing of the loop regarding science fiction. And then I met a widow with 3 babies and decided to settle down for a little while and kind of transfer a lot of what I had learned in doing what I was doing, making wildlife films or technology, media technology, things like that, into corporate life. And that was an interesting journey as well. But, in that I was more likely to get bored in a more corporate setting, my wife made the suggestion, hey, why don't you build those old airplanes you've always liked? I said, oh, that's a good idea. So my first one was a reproduction 1917 German Fokker triplane, just like the Red Baron flew, but mine had black and white stripes. And then after I flew and then sold that to an Air Force pilot, I built another aircraft, which was more whimsical in design, like something out of a Disney cartoon called a Flying Flea. And that's the aircraft that I was flying when on the second test flight, I lost my engine and crashed. And from that, I had my near-death experience.
So tell me about that near-death experience. Tell me about what happened.
Sure. So as I mentioned, I lost my engine and I could not make it back to the airfield. So because where the area I was flying in was very hilly, very forested, and very rocky, there were few options of where I could make an emergency landing. So I aimed for a small lake at a nearby Boy Scout camp and thought, well, if I can put it in the water, it's an open cockpit, I'll just pop my belt and swim out. And it probably went almost according to plan, but I overshot the bank and I crashed into all the trees at about 70 miles an hour, instantly turning my aircraft into matchsticks. And when I stopped crashing, there was no aircraft left around me. But I had also broken all my ribs, ruptured both lungs, my right leg, and multiple fractures. I had a hole in my lower back with some of the nerves from my back sticking out, and my chin was all cut up, skin was hanging down. Luckily for me, there was a man fishing nearby who saw everything, and he was a retired police officer. So, he had some experience in seeing trauma, maybe from car accidents and things like that. He wasn't someone who would just freak out when he saw the blood, and in the freaking out, I might die. So he kept me propped up so my ruptured lungs could gasp for air while the helicopter flew in, and then flew me up to Hartford, Connecticut's trauma center. And by the time my family and friends started to arrive a few hours later, I had already escaped my restraints once, and they had me in a breathing machine and all kinds of other tubes going in and out of me. And they suggested that I be put into a medically induced coma, to which everyone readily agreed. And while it's impossible to say, without having had a stopwatch, I would pretty much assume that when they put me into a coma here, that's when my near-death experience started. So the experience itself is quite different from many near-death experiences where you have some of the typical hallmarks of going through a tunnel, seeing dead loved ones, having a life review, maybe seeing angelic beings or demonic beings, and things like that. Mine was definitely different. For me, it was more like I just teleported instantly into a post-apocalyptic setting, like a ruined cityscape, 1,000 years after a nuclear blast or a meteor hits or something like that. And the only thing of interest was a large, maybe a 4 or 5 story high egg-shaped sculpture made out of open lattice work. And as I looked through that open lattice work, I could see these small gears that are a particular type of gear called a sector gear. It's just a section of a gear. The reason is it moves in a partial arc of movement with the beginning, middle, and end. And that was significant in ways I can explain later. But anyway, as I looked at each one of these gears, they were in varying degrees of focus. Some were very sharp and defined, and some were more ghost-like. But each one I looked at, it's as if a video feed of its meaning played in my head. And I realized after looking at a few that they were events in my future, because I might see myself as an older person. I might see my children with children of their own, things like this. And eventually I put my hand through the lattice work to see if I could feel one of these gears. Could I touch it? What would it feel like? And as I did, one particular gear just brushed by my hand, and I felt this intense, nauseating pain in my stomach. And with a reflex, I grabbed that gear, pulled it through the lattice work, and threw it away. And when I did, all of the gears started clacking around and moving around into a new configuration, accounting for the loss of one. And I remember asking, what is this? What's going on? And this disembodied voice spoke to me and stayed with me through the entire experience. And it said, basically, each gear is the probability of a thought, word, or action in your future, and your destiny is now resetting itself around what you have removed. And I said, well, how did I know I could do that? Remove that gear, removing that future moment. And the voice literally asked me, why else are you here? And I said, I have no idea. I don't even know where I am. And it said, you are in the in-between. And I said, in between what? And it said, everything, the impossible now between the past and the future. And this is much like the Tibetan Bardo. a place between life and death. And I said, this just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And it said it's impossible in its short duration. Yet here I am standing inside, the eternity of a single moment. And then it asked me if I remembered who I was in the world to which my body belonged. And I totally looked blankly into space and I could not remember. If you'd said, if you stay here any longer, you can't go back, I wouldn't have known where to go back or whom to go back to. And then it said, you see the truth and how the past is dust. So, I said, why do some of these futures, these gears that I touch, make me sick and not others? And it said, well, all choices have unintended consequences, some unfortunate and some not. And the pain each brings is your guide. And I said, well, where are the gears that feel good? And it said, you're not here to feel good. So basically, I was being given the opportunity to, and this is another thing that differentiates my near-death experience with many others. For many others who go through a tunnel, who see dead loved ones, who have a life review and get a big message, it's a somewhat passive experience. Mine was 110% interactive. It required action from me. And so what I was being given was the opportunity to remove what were essentially bad choices in my future, choices that would be to my spiritual detriment. And as I've said it before, it's like given the opportunity to stack the deck of cards in a way that would leave me with more good choices to choose from than having a lot of bad choices that could tempt me. And if you think about it, it really does boil down to choice. When things go right, people are happy. They may thank God. But when things go wrong, a lot of times people blame, some negative power or Satan. And they say, there's evil in the world as Satan. I'm like, why are you blaming Satan? He didn't do anything. He didn't have to do anything. We do it all. I said, maybe he presents choices, but at the end of the day, you're the one who is making that choice to do this thing. So that was a big lesson here was, how it's all choices. And what are choices, but what they say in quantum physics are superposition probabilities all stacked on top of each other. And it's our conscious viewing, it's our conscious decision that collapses one of those possibilities into a moment of right now reality, physical reality. And so at some point, as I continued through the process of feeling around to see what gears would hurt and which ones to remove, I realized after a time that I was getting a rather large pile of gears building behind me. And I said, it looks like if I don't have a bad future, I have no future at all. Am I going to die sooner from doing this? And it said, well, your destiny has to fit itself around futures that aren't meant to be. And said, your number of breaths are already counted. I will worry about your last one. And I said, I don't know how comforting that is. And it said, well, eliminating bad choices doesn't mean you won't make wrong ones. You can make a wrong choice and it's a mistake, and that itself is not a sin, right? You can make it with the best of intentions. But it said right and wrong are variables over which you really have no control. So the answers to what come tomorrow are a waste. Better is understanding the beauty of how everything fits and refits together. I basically was being told to have faith in the grand design, that everything has its place. And as a result, I don't pray, because why should I need to pray if God knows everything I need and God gives me what I need? And if I have to tell the creator of the universe, hey, I need to make next month's rent, that's not a prayer, that's a crisis of faith. So I have conversations with God, but I try not to really ask much of anything. There have been a few exceptions, but some of those have had some interesting repercussions. But more and more, I try to express my faith not in asking for things like he's Santa Claus, but just living in accordance with his will, that what I receive is what I'm supposed to have. And sort of tailor my needs around what I truly need, not just around what I want. Anyway, I asked this voice, I said, what am I missing here? Because I knew that whatever was going on was somehow the tip of the iceberg. I said, what's going on here? What am I missing in my lack of understanding? And it said, what is clearly before you? Grace. No one deserves salvation. It can only be given by grace, and that it is your birthright, but it must be chosen at the expense of the world that separates us. And I really got that. I really got that, because destiny may be written in our palms, but grace is tracked by no star, for it is by the whimsy of God that grace is extended in any shape or form. And I said, I kind of feel bad that I don't have a better moral compass in which to make these choices, to remove bad choices, than pain. It's not like I have a mantra. It's not like I have a spiritual idol or something higher than pain to use to guide me. And I said, I don't even know when or where these futures happen. How relevant are they to my life path? And it said, where, when are not important, but removing your enthusiasm to chain yourself to the world isn't as painful as carrying the crushing weight of those chains once forged around you. And then I realized, kind of like a mouse going through a maze or a cow down a chute, I said, it's like this place was made so I can do one thing and one thing only, with very little chance to screw it up. So in some way, this was grace. And then the voice said something that was probably one of the most profound things ever said to me in my life, or my afterlife. It said, if those with choices make poor use of them, then offering fewer possibilities could be called mercy. And then it said, you can't change the past, but you can make better choices in the future. Everything is interconnected, and pay more attention to your relationships. Be gentle with everyone as I'm gentle with you. I said, gee, what's gentle about all this? Because, I was thinking of how pain was so much a part of this experience. And then it said, you prayed for something for which being here is the answer. And now the man who fell from the sky is not the same who flew into it. And with that, it pretty much booted me out.
Wow. What a fascinating experience. It's so different from, like you said, from most near-death experiences. Now, he said, at one point you mentioned that he will worry about your last breath.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like you have a timestamp that you incarnated and at a certain date and time, that's your last breath? It's already predetermined?
Well, the saying really didn't imply that, did it? He simply said, I will worry about your last breath. It could be at any time. That's God, right? I mean, for me, it was God. So, I mean, it could be in 5 minutes, it could be in 50 years, mm-hmm. But at that moment, he will be there. And I get that. However, my understanding is I will die from a stroke when I'm 92 years old, when I'm outside walking across the grass. It'll be like a light switch. So I have a few more years yet, and I'm totally fine when that day comes.
Do you think that it seems so predetermined? I mean, you had the ability to remove these years. Do you think that we sort of have some kind of contract when we incarnate and certain things are predetermined, or what's your thought about that?
That's a great question, because it brings up some other questions to put a little bit of focus on it. You remember that I mentioned that some of these probable futures, these choices, some were very much in focus and some were not. I believe that the degree to which they were in focus was their probability coefficient, if you will. That if they were very clear and very definite, they were either very certain to occur, or they were probably very close in the future. And the ones that were less in focus were the ones that were more probable or further out in time. perhaps less likely to occur, but there was still some possibility. That's what it felt like. And so remember when I said, well, that's why I sort of think of this experience as an interactive life review, if you will, because if you think about it, a lot of times the life review is more about the past. How have you lived your life? How kind have you been? How loving have you been? How bad have you been? In which to, not necessarily be made to feel bad about our poor decisions, but to just sort of look at everything in context. But what actionable intelligence is there in trying to atone? To be able to be shown your future choices that have not yet occurred, but are fruits of the past. And now, by merely considering their choice, you can feel the pain one would bring. To me, that's providing actionable intelligence. And that is very worthwhile. And so all I can say is it was a huge probability matrix, if you will. And I was able to see to a great degree the choices that were in front of me based upon choices I'd made behind me. But by narrowing down more of the choices to be potentially better ones than bad ones, I was able to perhaps, as you say, not necessarily renegotiate the contract, but definitely to, let's just say, guide the conversation in a particular direction a little bit more with better outcomes, much more likely. Does that help?
Yeah. So were you spiritually inclined or religious before this happened? And how did this experience change the way you see yourself in the world?
Sure. I've always been spiritually inclined, and I've never been religious. I gave that a shot one or two Sundays, and that just wasn't going to work out for me. And what's interesting is that experience actually came to me while I was recuperating in the hospital, literally 50 years later. What happened was in June of 1969, my parents were finally done with all my questions about God. Because I was, as a little kid, again, I was interested in sci-fi, I was interested in animals and travel, and I was interested in God. And I want to know about God. And, and to me, there seemed in the late 1960s in the South, there was precious little information about God. There was plenty about you were going to burn in hell if you looked at anybody wrong in authority, but there wasn't a lot about, a loving, kind, non-judgmental God. And so they said, go to church down the street. So I walked literally 4 houses down the street to Highlands Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Florida. And the minister there, who'd been there for a few years, was named Reverend Coolidge. Now, he was a Cherokee Indian, very striking, very cool looking man. He's very tall, chiseled features, long black hair. I mean, he like a guy from a movie. I mean, central casting. He was just so cool. And I sat there and thought, wow, I've got my questions, but he's really busy before the service, maybe after the service. Well, not being a churchgoer, I didn't realize that after the service, now there's a line of people out the door who want to shake his hand and invite him to lunch or whatever. I was like, oh man, this is a disaster. I said, I'll have to think about this and come back next weekend. So I went back the next weekend. And as I'm sitting there in the pew, I keep looking for Reverend Coolidge to show up, and he's not showing up. Other people seem to be running around preparing for the service. And I looked at the lady next to me. This is turning into a synchronicity, in case you're wondering where it's going. And I said to her, where's Reverend Coolidge? Now, again, remember I said he'd been there for years. Name was on the sign out front for years. And she said to me, oh, we got rid of him. And I said, why? They said, well, he did the unthinkable. And I said, well, what was that? And she said, he married his daughter to a black man. Well, I just kept looking at her straight on I knew that makes no sense whatsoever, because I already knew at that age, like 12 or 13 years old, that spirituality has nothing to do with skin color, even though I was raised in, let's face it, in the South, a racist environment. But, my mom would come around the corner in the store and I'd be standing there with playing with, Black kids, Chinese kids, with the toys that we were pulling out of boxes and playing with. There was no problem. Kids don't have problems. They're taught to have problems. So I just stared straight ahead, and she probably took that for righteous indignation that, yes, we threw him out. And I said, I got to go home and figure this out with Mom. So I did. And Mom said, oh, yeah, that's right. I heard they got rid of him. I said, well, you could have told me before I went. I said, what's the story? Well, back in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a young up-and-coming singer named Rita Coolidge. She had associations with Kenny Loggins, Waylon Jennings, but she was a star in her own right, really, and very cool lady. Well, her slightly older sister, Priscilla, now again, so what I'm trying to say is she was a daughter of Reverend Coolidge, and her slightly older sister, Priscilla, Reverend Coolidge married to Booker T. Jones of Booker T. and the MGs, who was like a god in music. He opened for the Beatles. He could play anything, real talent. So it made sense to me that these two people could have met in the industry. They fell in love and they got married. That's a very natural story. You can almost guess that's how it would turn out. But because of that, they threw him out. For some reason, this story revisited me while I was recuperating in the hospital after my plane crash. And I realized that what God was saying was that essentially, number one, he was happy that I, for all my life, had asked questions about him. But it was a reminder, because that was the last time I went to church. It was a reminder that if I walked the ways of man, religion, I would come out with more questions than I went in with. But if I left the ways of man and I walked with God, we would color outside the lines. We would go places the entire world would say, oh, don't go there. That's dangerous. But he may not give me answers to my questions, but he would give me understanding. He would help me awaken to the questions. And that at the end of the day, as Reverend Coolidge discovered, any honor man bestows, man can take away. So that's my answer about how I became less religiously inclined and more spiritually inclined. And so traveling to all 7 continents, all over the world, the Titanic, North Pole, Mount Everest, and a lot of war zones, God's been my companion throughout all of that. And in war zones, I've been in firefights, some serious firefights, and I never felt afraid. I really felt one with God. I felt peace, incredible peace, while, the armored personnel carrier I'm standing next to is taking rounds from machine gun fire, mortar, shrapnel, a rocket-propelled grenade skipped by my feet only 6 feet away. And I asked a Buddhist priest one time, I said, why wasn't I scared? I had every right to be scared. He said, because in that moment, everything is true. There is no gray. It's all very clear. And I said, that is absolutely right. And so that's why I've had to go to places people would not generally think of going to find my truths. And I've been very grateful. And it's totally been like, flying without a net, like jumping off a cliff and just trusting there's enough wind to make you fly. But I, in a way, haven't had any choice about it either. I felt very compelled to have that faith in God and rely on God. And I think in the end, I just didn't want to have any other life than one in which I could have that kind of a faith. I think we're all wired in different ways, and that was the way I was wired.
So tell me about, what was it like, that recovery? You broke all your ribs, you punctured your lungs.
Other than that, I was fine.
What was it like when you sort of, came out of that coma, and what was that recovery look like? And how did you put everything into order, all those experiences that you had?
Well, that was, by the way, I was home 7 weeks after my crash. It doesn't mean I wasn't in a wheelchair or on a walker or butt hopping up the stairs for another month or two, but it was amazing how quickly I went home. In the hospital, whew, so I was in a coma for about a week, and then I came out, but I'd say it was another week before my brain and my mind were really functioning correctly, and I had any memory whatsoever. And at that time, I would say my first memories, I was already out of one hospital and into the rehabilitation hospital. And as with that initial sort of really return of consciousness, immediately, I used the term video feed before. It was like there was this video feed going on in my head of exactly the experience I described to you right now, just over and over and over. With each iteration, there was more depth of emotion, more detail, more oomph. And I'm like, what is this? First of all, think of how disoriented you are, right? And you have to have people tell you why you're there, really, because I don't have any memory of my plane crash either. I don't have any memory 2 days before my plane crash. I got my computer later on and looked at all my emails to say, what was the last email I remembered seeing? And it literally was 2 days before my crash. And so, I had to have people tell me, yeah, you were in a plane crash. Oh, wow. Okay. Which is, so if you think about it, it's interesting. In this great moment of lucidity called a near-death experience, with all this detail, all this, putting together the wisdom that this voice was giving me, there are two bookends of amnesia on either end of that incredibly lucid experience. I just find that interesting. Amnesia, lucidity, followed by amnesia, and then back to normalcy, and you just sort of have to put it together. So anyway, the first person I had some further conversations with that voice while I was laying there in the hospital. But the first person I shared my experience with was my nurse. She was my morning nurse. She was fantastic. Her name was Jen. And I realized at one point she just seemed to kind of be hanging out every now and then. Like she just liked hanging out, and because we would talk about all sorts of things. And so I said, do you mind if I tell you this thing that's going on in my head? And she said, sure. So I shared the story with her. And at some point she started crying. I said, well, why are you crying? She said, because I don't want you to die, because it's a near-death experience. And I said, well, you're a nurse in a hospital. You see death all the time. She said, yeah, but you're magical. And I think that's when I started to realize, when you hear about people coming back from an NDE with, heightened sensitivities or some abilities or whatever, mine was simply, I think, like extra empathy, enhanced empathy. And I think in a way that didn't just allow me to feel connected to people, but in some way they felt connected to me. And that was really nice. I said, I like that superpower. I mean, it'd be fun to fly or levitate or teleport or, talk to the dead, but the ability, because remember, God said, pay more attention to your relationships. And it's as if in giving me that as a marching order, he gave me the ability as well. And I don't know, that's just been a much more wonderful part of the journey as a result. And it's not one that is self-serving. It's one that, in feeling more connected with people, when we focus on that, it's very rewarding. And, especially in that the whole world's just gone through the social isolation of COVID. It was nice to be able to really kind of tune in with some people, even from afar, and to have that little extra ability to connect. Yeah.
Do you feel that experience that you had, the out-of-body near-death experience, do you feel that is as real as your physical life here on Earth? Or do you feel that experience seems more real than the physical life? Everybody has some different take on that. What was your feeling on
Right.
that?
No, it was absolutely real. It was, it's like they say, some people, it was more real than here. I would also say it was absolutely worth it. It's hard to say that, oh, I would do it all over again, but I know that that's probably what I should say and how I should feel. But where I'm at right now, I would say it was totally worth going through. Absolutely worth going through. And it's interesting. It was very real. And what's interesting is that the way the light was there, every now and then in the fall up here in New England, like in September or October, it's almost like for 5 minutes of some particular day, the light angle here is exactly like the light was in the in-between. And if I happen to look outside and see it, it's almost like a sock in the gut, like that pain that I experienced. And it takes like 3 or 4 days to get over it, for a split second of just seeing the light like that. And it's not a bad thing. It's more like it was such a powerful experience. It's such a powerful place. I'm convinced that part of what made it painful was I was probably just being stretched to the max to even be there. That, in other words, it's like I wasn't really worthy to be there for as long as I was, except by the grace of God. I was being stretched to be there, to have that opportunity. So, I mean, that's what growth is, right? Is stretching. Growth. We run until it hurts. We lift weights until it hurts, and sometimes maybe we stretch spiritually until it hurts in order to grow.
If you were going to summarize for someone what you learned from your NDE, what would be the big takeaway points for you?
Well, one of the things I was told on the other side, oh, okay, well, was that all the force of will you will ever need is found in the art of letting go. To always live life in celebration of the individual spirit. For no one and no thing can stand before the brilliance of a truly naked soul. So we could slice and dice that one a lot of different ways. But I would say that right now, where I'm focused on slicing and dicing it, is to really talk about authenticity and how important it is to live authentically. And I mean, that's when, Thoreau said, march to, the beat of your own drum. That's because if you don't, you're dancing to someone else's tune. So you tell me wherein lies the path of authenticity. And if a person is wanting to live a spiritual life, they first have to live an authentic life, because that deals with Socrates, man, know thyself. That deals with accepting, yourself, warts and all. And certainly there's a part of the near-death experience that is akin to looking into a mirror of truth. And once you do that, there's no not seeing what you've seen. And at that point, you start to look at life through the filters of what you need rather than just the filters of what you want. And so I think that's one way in which we become reharmonized to life, in such a way that synchronicities play a greater role. And we also start to think of our time in this world less in terms of self-service, and naturally more in terms of how we can help others. And I really wish there were shortcuts to all these things other than getting a 2x4 upside the head with a near-death experience. Some people legitimately, through living life right or meditation or anything less than, extreme case of dying or nearly dying, can do that. But if that's what it took to get me back on course, I'm fine with it. I'm fine with it.
So I know you wrote 2 books, the In Between, A Trip of a Lifetime, and then the practice in between, The Art of Letting Go. So can you tell us a little bit about these books and where people can find them?
Sure. Right after, I've only been to two of the conferences, annual conferences for IANS, the International Association of Near-Death Studies. And the first one I went to was Labor Day of 2019 in Pennsylvania. And then, of course, COVID came and there were no more until this past year in Salt Lake City. But at that conference, I went without any expectation of what I would find, who I would meet, whatever. And but I did know, and I did meet some more really incredible people who listened to my presentation of my NDE and said I should write a book. So I came home, sat down, and 3 months later I had a book finished, and then I submitted that to Lisa Hagen, and she published it. And then a lot of podcasts followed, and that was great. And then about a year later, I realized, and then, some people said I should do a YouTube channel. So I did a bunch of YouTube videos that are out there, just talking about different aspects of life and living from a spiritual perspective. And so a lot of people would respond saying, how do we actually put this into practice, the things you talk about? And so I thought about that. And so that's why the second book is called The Practice in Between, the Art of Letting Go. Because as I said a second ago, when God said all the force of will you'll ever need is found in the art of letting go, that came while I was sitting in the hospital recuperating as well. So I thought, I think I should return to that. And let's expand on that a little bit. And there's a really great saying that's a good place to start. And that's, I'm sure, you know of the samurai swordsman in ancient Japan, right? And there was a saying that on the field of battle, when a samurai draws his sword and throws away his scabbard, it's because he'll never need it again. That on this day, he's free to fight his best. That's how we're supposed to live our lives every single moment, with that much surrender, that much abandon, that much letting go. And a more accurate translation of the Aramaic in the Bible that says, be still and know that I am God, is actually let go and know that I am God. And so a lot of people have, I think, really picked this up and run with it. And, the themes about letting go and what it is to let go, and what does let go mean? What does surrender mean? It's definitely a letting go and a surrender, but you could do it with a warrior's heart. It's interesting, and it's sometimes paradoxical, but that's what my second book is about. And what's interesting is I wrote that second book in 1 month, and I don't remember writing it. I totally do not remember writing it. However, one night, as I was thinking, how do I actually write this book? I didn't sleep well all night. And then around 4:00 in the morning, I had this vision where these pages were suspended in air in front of me. And I could see words on them, but kind of to go back to my earlier analogy, they weren't quite in focus. And I said, what is this? And the voice said, these are the pages from your book. And I said, I can't read the words. And he said, well, that would be cheating because you haven't written it yet. So we don't want you to cheat. Okay. And I sort of thought, well, so why am I seeing this? And I'd already had another experience similar to this, and where the viewpoint of my mind would not be in my control. It would be changed. Like someone took over the steering wheel for a second and changed it, and then changed it back. And it was changing it between a linear and a non-linear perception of the information. And so that's what happened here. And so in the linear, I was aware of seeing the words. In the non-linear, for some reason, I was aware of seeing the rivers of white running between the words on the page. And then back and forth, back and forth. It's like it just starts flipping. And so you're saying word space, word space. And it's like making a point by doing that and doing it really fast. And so I realized what it was saying was use the rivers of white use the space between the words, that when you write, you are the words and the reader is the white. The reader is the space between the words that fills your words, and your words fill them. And that's where you connect. So I came back, and as I was writing the book and then formatting, and I realized, wow, a lot of these are turning into one-sentence paragraphs that they're so punchy, kind of like, I hate to say like fortune cookie sayings, but they were so concise in themselves, you wanted them to stand alone. And then I thought, and also by, the fact that they're a standalone paragraph means there's a slight extra space between it and the next paragraph to give the reader that slight half a second for the light bulb to go off over what you just said or what they just read. And that's when I realized, oh, I followed the format I was given to use the rivers of white, which literally was just by putting an extra space between paragraphs to give the reader a slight second extra for something to click. And I thought, how about that? I didn't even know I was following orders. And then you start to realize, maybe half the time when we are doing right things, we have no clue. We're just we're just going about our day, and somehow the path just bends to make sure we get to where we're meant to go. But that was an interesting thing, and I'm very happy with the book. It's shorter. For both books, I narrated the audible version, and I'm happy if people read the books, but honestly, I could care less if a book sells or not. I'm just happy to have done it. I did it because I felt I was told to. And if it brings benefit to anyone at all, it was worth the effort. And that's how I feel about it. Thank you.
Well, it's been such a pleasure to have you as a guest today. So if people want to learn more about you, do you have a website that they can go to?
I do. It's www.inbetweenproductions.com. And that's In Between Productions with an S. So that will take you right to the account of my NDE, a few popular webcasts, if you will. And also you can hit a button somewhere in there and reach out to me if you want to ask me any questions. I'll be happy to get back to you.
And I will put that in the podcast notes as well. So you can just go there and click on it and go straight to his website, as well as the link to his 2 books will also be in the podcast notes. So again, I want to thank you so much for taking the time and being a guest today.
Thank you, Dr. Lottie, and thank you to your viewers for the gift of their time.